If you do not have a budget, you do not have a strategy. If your budget is not in writing, it does not exist. If your written budget has been constructed without thoroughly researching what it costs to hire staff, pay the rent, the electric bill, or to produce and air the TV or radio commercials you need, or send the persuasion mail you plan to do, or the website you envision for your campaign, then you do not have a real budget. You have a disaster waiting to happen. I'm going to explain to you how to develop a budget and a cash flow chart. If you do that and do it right, you won't run out of money when you need it most. Do it poorly, and you'll find yourself in the same position of a one-time candidate for governor of California, who on Friday before the election discovered she'd run out of money. She went dark on TV during the last weekend of the campaign, just as voters were making up their minds. That mistake ended her career in public life. At the outset, let me make clear that I cannot tell you what your budget should be. I don't know what you're running for. I don't know what your strategy is. I don't know how much you can raise. That is not what this tutorial is about. It is about the basics of constructing your budget, your cash flow chart, what to budget for, making sure you ask the right questions, and some techniques you can use to make sure you have an accurate picture and an accurate assessment of what it will cost to run your campaign. Although that may sound complicated, it is not to the agencies and professionals who are used to doing it. Where to start? Divide your budget into two parts, that which I call direct voter contact and that which I'll refer to as overhead. What is direct voter contact? Those are the tools you use to communicate directly with voters. Benchmark and tracking polls, your website, television, radio, persuasion mail, professional phone banks, newspaper advertising, your door-to-door operation. What is overhead? Staff, consultants, headquarters, your rent, utility bills, accountants, legal counsel, fundraising costs, candidate and staff travel. You will need to budget for both. And the trick will be to avoid spending too much of your money on overhead at the expense of your advertising budget. You can have the best paid staff, the highest paid consultants, the nice office space, and great looking furniture. Terrific. That is a good way to lose an election if those luxuries come at the expense of money you should be devoting to advertising. Your message is what wins an election, and if you do no advertising, no one will ever hear your message. This is a general rule of thumb. You want at least 2/3 or more of your budget going to direct voter contact, the tools you use to communicate your message directly to voters. 1/3 or less should go to overhead. Let's go back to direct voter contact. How much you spend on the items I'm about to discuss and the appropriate mix of your advertising budget between TV and radio and mail and phones will depend on what you learned in your benchmark survey. That is not something I can tell you without knowing your strategy. What I can tell you is this: it is essential that you have an accurate picture of what things cost. Not an estimate, not a guess, but real numbers. And it is equally important that you know when you are going to spend how much on what. Your budget for direct voter contact? If you are running in a large jurisdiction, you will probably want to use professional help on things like your website, media buying, TV and radio production, persuasion mail, telephone banks, and polling. Firms you talk to should be able to give you an accurate assessment of what their services will cost. If they can't, don't hire them. I'll give you an overview of the kinds of questions you should be asking and the items you should be budgeting for to ensure that you don't get an unpleasant surprise. Let's start with polling. There are two kinds of polling: benchmark surveys and tracking studies. Benchmarks are used to determine your strategy, the macro message of your campaign, and the micro messages you intend to fire at certain demographic targets. Usually, benchmark surveys are the most expensive surveys that a campaign will do. What it costs will depend on the number of people interviewed, the length of the questionnaire, and what we in the polling industry call the incidence rate. How many people must be called to secure a completed interview? And by that I mean this: not everyone called is going to complete the survey. Some will hang up halfway through the survey, and if you are screening for likely voters in an off-year election, you will have to make more calls to find those likely voters than you would in a presidential year. The point of telling you this is that you just can't call a poll taker and ask how much a benchmark survey costs. Nobody can give you an accurate estimate without knowing how many people you are going to poll, how many questions you need to ask, and the incidence rate. How many you poll will depend on the jurisdiction you are polling. It is common to do 1,000 interviews in a statewide campaign. In smaller and less complicated jurisdictions, you can usually get by with 300 to 750 interviews. How many questions? I fielded benchmark surveys that had more than 100 questions, and some with only 45. It depends on how much information you want and are willing to pay for. Your benchmark is the most important poll you will do. The data is your campaign Bible. It is not a place to cut corners or try to get by on the cheap. Tracking studies are short surveys used to monitor the progress of your campaign, how well your communication strategy is working, and a way to gauge how events are affecting your race. In a long and complicated campaign, you will probably need several. And in a hard-fought race for governor or U.S. senator, you may want to do daily tracking studies. You need to include them in your budget. Your website. In this day and age, it is a must. If you can afford nothing else, at least have a campaign website. It need not be complicated. It need not cost a lot. Make sure your website includes your biography, information that says something about your values, and your positions on important issues of the day. The volunteer email sign-up contribute button should be visible on every page of your website, and you should have pictures on every page that flatter you. The home page should be updated frequently with news articles, information on campaign events, fundraisers, or commentary, so that it has a unique look every time a viewer visits. Your website budget should include the cost of building the site, the entity you are paying to host the site, and the fees you will incur for those credit card donations. The more bells and whistles, the more interactive features such as blog software, the more you should expect to pay. You should insist on a written estimate of your cost from your webmaster and a number in writing of what they will charge you for updating the homepage and press page. Most website firms now offer software that allows campaign staff or volunteers to easily change content. Television. If you plan to use television, you need to know what time cost and an accurate estimate of what it will cost to produce your spots. About your time buy, do you plan on airing TV spots on commercial stations? If you have purchased your own time in a campaign, then you will be familiar with terms like reach, frequency, share, cum, and gross rating points. If you have not and have never heard those terms, hire an experienced media buyer. Delegate the task to someone who knows what they are doing so that you can be a full-time candidate. Tell your buyer what your demographic targets are, how many spots you plan to produce over the course of the campaign, and how many weeks you want to be on. They should then be able to tell you what it will cost. And know this: reach and frequency is everything. The average viewer needs to see a political spot 6 to 8 times over the course of a week before it registers. For the average viewer to see your spot 8 times in 1 week, you'll need to budget for roughly 800 gross rating points. During the final phase of a campaign, it is not unusual for candidates to buy 1,200 to 1,500 gross rating points a week in a given media market. So let's suppose you want to produce and air 5 different television spots. You should budget for 4,000 to 6,000 gross rating points if you really expect your target audience to see all 5 spots. Commercial stations are usually willing to offer candidates a preemptible rate during the early stage of an advertising campaign. meaning your spot will air if the stations cannot sell the time to someone else willing to pay more than you. If you are advertising early, you can probably save money by buying preemptible time. During the final weeks of a campaign, when many candidates are on the air and there is fierce competition for time, you should plan to pay the non-preemptible rate. The most frequent mistake that candidates make is not putting enough points behind a spot or spreading their buy too thin or over a time period that is too long. Better to do 4 spots and spend the money it takes to make sure they are seen than 8 spots with a buy that is too thin for anyone to notice that you are on the air. Do you plan to use cable television? If so, ask your buyer to tell you what networks are watched by your target audience, what the rate per spot is during morning, day, and prime time, and how much you will be allowed to buy in each time slot. Some cable companies place strict limits on the number of political spots they are willing to sell on a given network. You cannot budget accurately if you don't know what the rules are. What to pay your media buyer? The standard agency commission is 15%, meaning that when an agency places a spot on your behalf for $1,000, the agency is charged $850 by the TV station and then pockets the difference as its compensation. There is no law that says you have to pay full agency commission to a media buyer or advertising firm. I've negotiated deals with agencies to place time for as little as 3% commission. Production cost. Be realistic about what it costs to produce a good TV spot. Sometimes it is the only way that a voter will know you, and the TV screen is the only place they will ever see you. You will not get a second chance to make a first impression, and a poorly produced spot will do you more harm than good. Unless you've done it before and know what you are doing, use an experienced agency or director to produce your spot. Decide your message, write it, or have your agency write the script, and then decide what visuals are required to convey the message. Still photographs, footage done in a studio, footage that requires a crew to travel to 1 or more locations. Also make sure you budget for professional voice talent and music fees. Have the agency storyboard your commercial and make them give you a firm estimate before the commercial is produced. Radio. There are more radio stations than commercial TV stations, and it is easier to reach a specific demographic target on radio than commercial television. News talk and country music and adult contemporary stations will reach more likely voters than some punk rock station heard by teenagers. Neither your media buyer nor a radio sales rep can give you an estimate of what radio advertising will cost unless you first tell them what your target audience is. And remember those words, reach and frequency and cost per point. Radio is like television. Spread it too thin or over too many stations and nobody will hear your ad. Better to concentrate on fewer stations or a specific demographic and buy at saturation levels. What is saturation? At least 1 spot an hour, if not more. Radio production. Anybody who has ever listened to radio has heard the good and the bad. The good and the effective and the memorable are the spots with real production values. Music, sound effects that trigger images in the human mind, done with professional voice talent. The irritating is the boring candidate talking to a bad microphone in an empty room with an echo that compels your finger to switch the station. The point? You can't produce a radio spot for 3 cents that anyone will want to hear. Make sure your budget includes enough money for professional engineers, editors, music licensing fees, and professional voice talent. Absentee voter program. If your state or jurisdiction allows people to vote early, and nearly all do, then some people will be voting before your advertising campaign has run its course. You will want to segment this piece of the electorate and give them a compelling reason to vote for you long before Election Day. For example, you only have enough money to run a solid advertising campaign for 2 weeks. Yet the laws in your jurisdiction allow some people to start voting 4 weeks out. Put in your budget a piece of mail or 2 or 3 to ensure that absentee voters know who you are and why they should vote for you, and send it to them before they start voting. Persuasion mail. Like media buying and media production, I advise candidates to use a professional persuasion mail firm. It is a complicated process with several moving parts, from copy to design to printer to mail house to post office. It is not something to be done by someone who has never done it before. Regardless of whether you use a professional firm or try it yourself, these are the items you should include in your persuasion mail budget. Pictures, the cost of acquiring and cleaning your mailing list, design and layout fees, printing, postage, processing, and delivery charges. A word about those. Budget for a professional photographer, not some amateur with a camera who happens to be a friend of your cousin Chris. Early in your campaign, take a day or half day and do a real photo shoot. Even the best print designers cannot produce compelling mail absent a decent photo file. Budget for an experienced designer who can show you what they have produced for other candidates, someone used to working under difficult deadlines who knows what the postage regulations are and who can make your mail piece stand out on a day when voters may be receiving mail from several candidates. Candidates use mail because it can be precisely targeted. Include in your budget the cost of acquiring your mailing list and hiring someone who knows what they are doing to sort, segment, and clean your list before you use it. It will cost money to print your material. Use a printer who's used to working under difficult deadlines, one who has experience with political candidates. Be prepared to tell them the size of your pieces, the number of folds, the paper stock, the colors, and how many you want to print, and ask for written estimates. Most candidates use a bulk permit to send their mail, and I suggest you do, but don't try to sort your mail for the post office if you've never done it before. Use a mail house that has done political mail, knows what is involved, how to sort it, and red tag it. If the mail house you are talking to does not know what red tag means, leave. Find a different mail house. Good ones can look at your list and tell you exactly how much postage will be required to send 40,000 postcards to your target audience and exactly what their processing charges will be. Newspaper advertising. Newspaper advertising is sometimes the only way to reach voters in a small jurisdiction. If you must resort to it, it is something you will need to include in your budget. A precaution: just because the newspaper tells you they have 50,000 subscribers does not mean that 50,000 will see your display ad. Many people read daily newspapers online and never see the print ads. You may find that a better use of your money is a banner ad on the newspaper website that links visitors to your website. If you're planning on using display advertising, know that full-page ads are more likely to be noticed than half-page or quarter-page ads. That is why they are more expensive. Professional telephone calls. There are 3 types of calls: ID calls, persuasion calls, get out the vote calls. ID calls are those which discern who is for you, who is not, and those who have not made up their mind. Persuasion calls are those used to sway the undecided voter. Get out the vote calls are those which motivate your voters to go vote. If yours is a low-budget campaign in a small jurisdiction, you may be able to rely on volunteers to do your phone work. If not, you need to include in your budget the cost of a professional phone bank. There are plenty of firms that do it. They can give you accurate estimates if you are able to tell them how many voters are on your call list who have valid telephone numbers. Talk to 2 or 3 firms, check their references, get a quote and get it in writing so that you know what to budget for. Your organization. Posters cost money, handouts and brochures cost money. Decide what your print runs need to be and budget accordingly. And if you are deploying a small army to knock on doors during the final days of your campaign, and I suggest you do, add something to your budget for walk lists, food, and drinks for the volunteers. If your volunteers feel unappreciated, they won't come back. Now that we've covered what you need to include in your budget for direct voter contact, let's turn our attention to your overhead budget, starting with your staff. The most important person on your staff, if you're going to have a paid staff, is your campaign manager. The manager's job is to run the campaign so that you can be a candidate. The manager's job is to sweat the details so that you can concentrate on the big picture. Your speeches, public appearances, your debates, TV and radio and newspaper interviews, and to ensure that you, the candidate, get the rest you need. What does a manager cost? Whatever you're willing to pay them. Just make sure you can afford it. Although I cannot tell you how much staff you need, I can tell you there are important tasks in every campaign that need to be done by somebody, either hired help or a very dependable volunteer. Issue and opposition research, a press person, a volunteer coordinator, and someone that handles the day-to-day work on your website, and the staff that is assigned to help raise money. Budget accordingly. And your consultants? Good ones cost money. Before you hire one or more, check their references, including those that they have worked for who lost. Did they do quality work? Were they there when they were needed? Did they meet their deadlines? Did they produce what they were supposed to produce within the budget they were given? Ask these questions before you hire them. Other things to include in your overhead budget: headquarters space, rent, phones, cell phones for staff, supplies, stationery, furniture, utilities, and some food for those nights when your staff is working until midnight. Don't forget your compliance costs. If you are running in a place where one must circulate petitions to get on the ballot, budget for an experienced election law attorney to make sure your signatures are in order before you submit them. You may need to budget for an accountant to ensure that your contribution and expenditure reports are filed correctly and on time. It costs money to raise money: postage for letters, food and drinks at fundraising events, banking costs, and credit card processing fees for those who give online. And you, the candidate. You need a decent wardrobe, you will need to travel, gas and planes and hotels cost money. You have to eat, and staff that travels with you will as well. How many staff people you choose to have, what you choose to pay them, how many offices you choose to staff is up to you. However, when you're done constructing your preliminary budget, if your overhead costs are more than 35% of your total budget, something is out of line. You are putting too much into overhead. Once you have constructed a preliminary budget, do a gut check. Take a look at the fundraising side of the equation. You cannot do a $3 million budget if you can only raise $2 million. So now that you have your spending wish list, take a hard look at your fundraising plan. Plot your income by source, then plot it by month. In DVD 2, I explained the rudiments and fundamentals of raising money and 7 different ways of doing it. Put some numbers to paper, starting with candidate solicitation. How many names are on your list? How many people are you going to call or see? How much are you going to ask of each person? When do you plan to do it? I usually advise first-time candidates to do this before they make a public announcement for several reasons. Number 1, sometimes candidates have a very unrealistic notion of how much money they can raise. Forcing them to get on the phone and raise money early from family and friends is often the only way to learn what a realistic budget will be. A lot of the money you raise will come from people you ask or touch or personally solicit. Number 2, sometimes candidates learn they can't ask for money. Better to know that you can't play the game before you walk onto the field than to embarrass yourself midway through. If you can't ask for money, rethink what you're doing. And number 3, if you can put a sizable chunk of money in the bank before you make a formal announcement, it will enhance your credibility and ensure that the press and other would-be contributors will take your campaign seriously. Surrogate solicitation. Who and how many people are you going to ask to help you raise money? How much are you going to ask each to raise? When are you going to ask them to have it done? Direct mail. Are you going to use this method of raising money? If so, who are you going to solicit? How many names are on the list you plan to mail? When are you going to do it? How much do you think you can raise when? Email solicitation. You may have no idea during the early stage of a campaign how much you can raise from those who visit your website or by soliciting those who leave their email address. That's okay, so put 0. To the extent that your campaign takes off, attracts attention, and you begin to receive sizable donations, you can always adjust your budget upward. That's what Obama did. Cocktail parties, dinner parties, large and celebrity events. How many of these are you going to have? Who's going to host them? What do you expect to raise from each? When are you going to do them? Once you have plotted your income by source and by month, match it to your campaign budget and see where you are. I usually construct 3 budgets in every campaign. Budget A is the wish list budget. What we'll do if the fundraising really goes well or exceeds expectations. Budget B is more conservative, but premised on the notion that the race will be competitive and that a campaign will attract donations from contributors the candidate does not know. Budget C is the bare bones budget, what we'll have available to spend even if the only money we ever have is what the candidate is willing to invest of their own or raise from family and friends. A word of advice to you if you plan to run, you should do the same. This is what will happen if you don't. You'll end up spending too much money too early and find there's not enough left during the final months of the campaign when voters are making up their minds. Or you'll hire more staff than you can afford and be forced to lay off staff midway through the campaign. When that happens, it will get into the papers and you will have a bad day. Or you'll find yourself with a big stack of unpaid bills 10 days after the campaign is over and people lined up at your door expecting you to pay. And one other thing, campaigns do sometimes go through cash flow problems and have difficulty meeting payroll. If that happens, ask the highly paid people or the consultants to wait a week or two. Never stiff the worker bees. When they get stiff, they talk, and everybody will know that you've missed payroll. Budget A, Budget B, Budget C. And now you've matched it against 3 different fundraising scenarios. And you've plotted what you expect to raise against what you want to spend to ensure that you are never short of cash. Are you done? No, but you do have a good start. Campaign budgets are living documents. They must be constantly revised and revisited. Some do's and don'ts about adjusting your budget. You'll spend more in the final month of a campaign than any other month. So if your fundraising is going better than expected and you think you can do the budget B instead of the budget C, supplement your budget from the back end forward. And by that I mean take a look at what you had expected to spend during the last 4 weeks and make sure all of the programs are fully funded before you allocate money to a different time period. It does you no good to be leading the race in September if that means you'll be out of money before November. The funds you raise from family and friends will be the easiest money you raise. And when that early money comes in, sometimes candidates are tempted to spend money on frivolous things that are not in the budget. Resist that temptation. Work just as hard at not spending your early money as you do raising it. There'll be plenty of places to use it toward the end of the campaign. If you are tempted to hire extra staff that is not in your budget, first ask yourself this. Are important things that really matter falling through the cracks because your staff is exhausted and overworked? If the answer is no, you don't need more staff. You need to tell your current staff to put in more hours. Oh, and about those consultants you may have sitting at your table, they will always be able to come up with new ways to spend money you don't have. And sometimes their suggestions will be good ideas. Make sure you can afford it before you do it. Make your consultants tell you what to cut so that you can fund their great idea. Make sure there is someone on your staff whose job it is to monitor the fundraising, oversee the expenditures, and report to you or the campaign manager at least once a week. You'll sleep better. It will ensure that there's budget discipline and that you don't end your campaign with a stack of unpaid bills. If you think it's hard raising money during a campaign, try raising it after you've lost. And about those consultants you may hire, there are many good ones who know a lot more about the business than you do, who can help you construct your budget, keep your campaign on track, and navigate the minefields of political combat so that you secure the victory you want. Read their contracts. Make sure you have a full understanding of how they make their money and how much of their time you are going to get. Putting together a budget and a fundraising plan is not glamorous work. It is, however, the only way to ensure that you have the money you need when you need it, and that you don't end up on the hook for campaign bills that may take you years to pay. I'm Jay Townsend. Thanks for listening.